My grandmother's name was Alara. It meant a star, a light. And that is exactly what she had been in my life. The single, constant beacon in a confusing, often dark domestic sky. My mother, Evelyn, was the tempest, the black cloud that only knew how to produce thunder and rain, never quiet warmth. I was Rhiannon Hayes, the daughter who always existed in the crosshairs of that conflict, the calm of Alara's influence battling the chaos of Evelyn's control. I was 25 when Alara died, but I felt 15 again, lost and reaching for a hand that was no longer there. The silence in Alara's small, sun-drenched house was the most profound sound I had ever heard. Every object felt like a ghost. The well-worn leather of her armchair, permanently indented by her small frame, the faint, comforting scent of lavender and old paper that clung to the air like a benevolent spirit, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock that had now stopped forever at 2:17 p.m., the exact moment the hospice nurse confirmed the silence in her chest. I wandered the rooms, my fingers tracing the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, trying to memorize the texture of a safe place before it, too, was stripped bare. But of all the spectral objects, one was the most potent, the most painfully absent, the locket. It wasn't a grand piece of jewelry. To an outsider, it was simply an antique, early Victorian, made of rose gold that had oxidized and mellowed into a dusky salmon hue. Its surface was engraved with delicate, almost microscopic forget-me-nots, symbols of eternal remembrance, winding around a central, empty cartouche. It hinged open to reveal two small oval compartments. In one, there was a faded tintype of a young man in a stiff collar, Alara's grandfather, lost at sea during a storm off the coast of Maine. In the other, a tiny, intricately folded slip of paper, too brittle to unfold, too sacred to ignore. This locket, this small, heavy circle of metal, was the focal point of my connection to Alara and the core of a family secret that now felt hollowed out and gone. Alara had always been the curator of our lineage, the one who understood that history wasn't in textbooks, but in the hands that held certain objects. She'd explained that the locket had been passed down specifically through the maternal line, but had skipped my mother, Evelyn, because Evelyn, even as a girl, had dismissed it as old junk that needs polishing in favor of modern, chunky silver. "It knows where it's meant to go, Rhea," Alara had told me once, tracing the delicate engraving with a crooked finger. "The people who keep it are the ones who cherish the story more than the shine." The last time I saw Alara alive, just 3 weeks before the inevitable decline took her, she'd been sitting up in bed, frail but lucid. The locket lay on the crisp white linen sheet, catching the afternoon light. It looked small and isolated against the expanse of white. "Come here, darling," she'd murmured, her voice thin as tissue paper. I sat beside her and took her hand. It felt delicate, like a bird's bones, and smelled faintly medicinal now, overlaying the lavender. "Do you know what this is, Rhea?" she'd asked, using the pet name derived from my full name, Rhiannon. "It's the family heart, Grandma," I'd replied, the words we always used. A ritual as comforting as a psalm. Yes, and a heart must go to someone who knows how to keep it safe. Someone who understands that its value isn't counted in pounds sterling, but in years loved. She paused, fixing me with those clear, pale blue eyes that always saw right through the nonsense of the world. Eyes that looked remarkably strong even now. "I want you to have this, Rhea. It's written down, but sometimes wills get complicated. Your mother has a way of complicating things when money is involved. I'm telling you now, so you know. It's yours. It has always been yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She'd handed me the locket, warm from her body heat, and for a moment, the rose gold seemed to pulse with a faint, ephemeral light, a final transference of love and caution. I had kissed her cheek, promising her I would keep it, treasure it, and pass it on with the same careful reverence. The promise felt like a sacred vow, taken in the shadow of death. Now, standing in the emptied space of her living room, I felt the sickening drop of a fear I hadn't been ready to face. Alara had been right. Wills do get complicated, especially when my mother, Evelyn Hayes, the queen of complication and avarice, was involved. I knew with a certainty that iced my blood that Evelyn would never allow $15,000 worth of old junk to bypass her hands and go directly to me. The official reading of the will took place a week after the funeral, a necessary formality that felt obscene given the fresh grief. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with residual mourning and sharp, new anxiety. The only people present were myself, my father, and my mother. My father, Richard, was physically present but emotionally 1,000 miles away. He sat hunched over, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly at the dark wood paneling, a man who had long ago chosen passive retreat over active conflict. His silence was another heavy presence in the room. Evelyn was the counterpoint. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit that looked expensive and slightly aggressive, accessorized with a string of pearls that seemed too pristine for the occasion. She sat forward on the lawyer's stiff antique chair, her movements sharp and impatient, her eyes darting around the room, less interested in mourning and more in calculating inventory. The attorney, Mr. Harrington, was a man of precise movements and quiet tones. He began reading the legal jargon, detailing the bequests of property, bank accounts, and investments. Alara had always been a tidy person, and her estate was surprisingly straightforward. Most of the monetary assets were split evenly between my father and his sister, Aunt Carol. The tension mounted when Mr. Harrington reached the tangible personal property, the family items. To my daughter, Carol Jenkins, I leave the sterling silver tea service, as she so admired its pattern and historical significance. Mr. Harrington read. Aunt Carol wasn't present, having been estranged from Evelyn for years, but the bequest was noted. Evelyn made a small, contemptuous noise, a suppressed snort of indignation that Carol had received anything of value. Finally, he reached the items specifically designated for me. I held my breath, gripping my hands together beneath the table, bracing for a technicality, a confusion, a loophole. And to my granddaughter, Rhiannon Hayes, as a direct transmission of lineage and love, I bequeath the antique rose gold Victorian locket, currently held in the walnut jewelry box in the master bedroom, appraised at $15,000 in 2018. Relief flooded me, so intense it almost made me dizzy. It was written down, not just the locket, but the antique rose gold Victorian locket, specified by location and recent appraisal value. Alara had kept her promise with careful, legally sound language. My mother, Evelyn, sniffed loudly, a sound of aggressive, dismissive judgment. 15,000? That old thing? That sounds wildly inflated, honestly. Granny was always sentimental. I'm surprised she didn't try to leave the chipped porcelain bird to the Queen of England. My father, who had been staring at the wall, merely cleared his throat, a low, nervous rumble, but said nothing to defend either the appraisal or me. Mr. Harrington continued, unfazed by Evelyn's interjection. The rest of the household effects, including furniture, minor jewelry, and personal items, are to be divided equally between Mrs. Jenkins and Mrs. Hayes. The meeting concluded shortly after. As we walked out to the car, Evelyn's demeanor shifted instantly from rigid, formal propriety to cold, focused calculation. Well, that's that, she said, pulling the car door shut with unnecessary force. A rather messy affair. I'll need to go back to the house tomorrow. The division of the rest of the household effects is going to be tedious. That hideous blue vase, for instance, must be worth something, and I need to inventory the minor jewelry before Carol can swoop in. What about the locket, Mom? I asked, my voice calm but my stomach twisting with the first tight knot of fear. I'd like to pick it up. Grandma said it was in her walnut box. Evelyn didn't meet my eyes. She reversed out of the parking space with a sharp jerk, then pulled out onto the road with a squeal of tires, as if trying to outrun the proceedings. Oh, that old thing? Don't worry about it, Rhiannon. I took care of it. A profound, ice-cold chill went down my spine. You took care of it? What does that mean, exactly? It was in the walnut box. She sighed dramatically, leaning heavily on the steering wheel at a red light. It means exactly what I said. The will was actually quite confusing, darling. That attorney read it so fast. It wasn't clearly separated from the minor jewelry list and the master inventory. Honestly, the old woman wrote it on the back of a napkin, practically, as I told the lawyer. Mr. Harrington just read it out. It was explicit. The antique rose gold Victorian locket, appraised at $15,000 to me, I countered, my voice rising slightly, the knot in my stomach tightening into a fist. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her profile sharp and uncompromising. Yes, the locket. But you know your grandmother was suffering from increasing cognitive decline near the end. She was confused about who had what. I simply gathered up all the small valuables and put them aside for safekeeping until the true value and ownership could be ascertained. She used the word safekeeping like a weapon, loaded with implication of my own carelessness. Besides, you live in that tiny, unsecured apartment. It's far too valuable for you to be responsible for right now. I'd hate for you to be robbed. The thinly veiled possessiveness and the insult to my living situation sickened me. Mom, I just want my locket. It was her last gift, and it's legally mine. Please, just tell me where you put it. She finally glanced at me, her face a mask of patronizing concern, the kind she always used when she was about to dismiss my feelings entirely. It's fine, Rhiannon. I'm managing the whole estate. I'll figure out the best place for it. Perhaps a better, more secure appraiser. Now stop being dramatic. You're getting half the cash inheritance, after all. That's what really matters. Focus on the real money, not sentimental trinkets. Her words were the confirmation I dreaded. Evelyn had intercepted it. She had stolen it before the ink on the will was even dry, before the mourning period had even concluded. She'd done it out of pure, unadulterated greed, and she was already trying to cover it with a thin veil of legal confusion and maternal condescension. The fight, I knew, was not just about the locket anymore. It was about proving my grandmother's last wish and facing down the woman who had always sought to control and diminish me. 2 days later, I went back to Alara's house. My official excuse was to help clear out the kitchen cabinets, but my primary mission was to confirm the locket's exact position before my mother's act of safekeeping. I needed to establish its last known location in the house for my future case. The house felt colder now, stripped not just of Alara's presence, but already subtly of her style. Evelyn was already there, directing a pair of movers to take furniture she'd arbitrarily claimed for herself, a mahogany table, and 2 antique Persian rugs. She wore practical jeans and a tight, cynical expression, shouting instructions over the heavy shuffle of feet. She was already treating the house like a liquidation warehouse. I slipped away upstairs to the master bedroom. It was quiet, untouched by the movers, still smelling faintly of Alara's familiar lavender sachets and a hint of antiseptic. The walnut jewelry box sat on the dressing table, exactly where it had always been, a familiar anchor in the shifting sea of the room. It wasn't locked. Alara had never seen the need for locks in her home. Her morality was based on trust, a concept Evelyn clearly lacked. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, repetitive drumbeat of dread. I lifted the heavy lid, the familiar creak of the hinge sounding deafeningly loud. The box was compartmented, lined with a faded blue velvet. Inside, nestled on the plush fabric, were a few inexpensive costume pieces, a pair of clip-on earrings from the 1970s, a broken pearl bracelet, a few silver chains that had tarnished black. The compartment where the rose gold locket belonged, the one perfectly sized for its specific oval shape, was empty. My breath hitched in my throat. The space where the locket used to rest was a small, perfectly sized impression in the velvet, a smooth, undisturbed oval, where the heavy metal had compressed the fabric over years of quiet residence. It looked like a footprint left in snow, clear evidence of a recent departure. I checked under the other pieces, my hands scrambling. I shook out the velvet lining of the box, ran my fingers over the edges, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was gone. The sense of violation was immediate and sharp. A sudden, fierce nausea overtook me. It wasn't just the loss of the money, $15,000, which was a fortune to me, a young woman scraping by as a freelance graphic designer. It was the violation, the disrespect to Alara's final, explicit wish. It was the complete confirmation of Evelyn's nature, that she valued a quick cash infusion, an act of spiteful control, more than her own mother's memory, more than her daughter's emotional inheritance. I forced myself to walk back downstairs, my steps heavy, the empty jewelry box imagery burned into my mind. I found Evelyn in the hallway, giving instructions to a mover regarding the side table. "Mom, the locket is gone from the jewelry box," I stated, keeping my voice low and steady despite the tremor that started in my hands and traveled up my arms. She didn't flinch, she simply turned, her eyes narrowed, already calculating how to deflect. "I told you, Rhiannon. I put it somewhere safe. Stop trying to rummage around the estate, it's undignified." "Safe where? In a bank vault? Or did you already take it to a dealer?" I pressed, the accusation clear and cold in my tone. "Where is the $15,000 heirloom that was explicitly willed to me?" She laughed, a short, sharp, entirely humorless sound that always signaled her maximum defensiveness. "You are truly delusional, you know that? The entire estate is my responsibility to manage. I have bills to pay for the funeral, for the estate taxes, for the hospice care. Do you think things just magically pay for themselves?" I had to liquidate a few items to cover the initial outlay. It was all minor jewelry, part of the general estate, until the lawyers sort out that confusing little clause about an antique piece. Honestly, I didn't even get the $15,000, so you shouldn't be so dramatic about the value. Liquidation. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. She had sold it. She had snatched my grandmother's last gift and turned it into cash, likely within hours of the funeral. "That locket was specifically bequeathed to me," I said, enunciating every syllable, feeling a terrible clarity descend. It was not minor jewelry. The will specified it by name, metal, and appraisal value. "You've committed theft, Mom. You stole from the dead and from your own child." Nonsense. The appraisal was 6 years old, and the value is certainly exaggerated for sentimentality. If it was so important, why didn't she leave it to you before she died, in a legally simple way? Clearly, she was still holding on to it, which means it remained part of the estate. Evelyn waved a dismissive hand, turning back to the movers. "Look, I'll tell you what. I'm feeling generous. Once everything is settled and the real division of the estate happens, I'll give you an extra $750 just to stop your tiresome emotional blackmail and whining. How about that? It's more than fair for a trinket that probably sold for $5,000. $750 for an item appraised at $15,000. She was insulting me, assuming I was too naive, too emotional, and most importantly, too poor and legally powerless to do anything about it. She was trying to buy my silence and my acceptance of her dominion. "No, Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but cutting through the chaos of the moving men's shuffling. "I don't want your $750. I want what is mine. And I'll get it back, all $15,000 of its value." She didn't even look at me this time. "Oh, and how exactly will a starving artist like you manage that? You can barely afford your rent, let alone a lawyer." "You're pathetic, Rhiannon. You lose, just like you always do when you go up against reality." She stepped away, her back a final, cold wall I couldn't breach. In that moment, standing in the cold light of Alara's empty bedroom, the rage was no longer hot. It was a cold, hard, unyielding core. Evelyn had mistaken my vulnerability for weakness. She had mistaken my poverty for powerlessness. She wasn't just stealing a locket. She was stealing my grandmother's final act of love and control over my life. I wouldn't just lose. I couldn't. I owed Alara more than that. Evelyn was right about one thing. I was broke. The idea of hiring an estate lawyer to contest an act of conversion was laughably out of reach. Legal counsel for an estate dispute would cost a retainer of thousands of dollars up front, which I absolutely did not possess. I had $800 in my savings account dedicated to a strictly for emergencies fund, and my freelance graphic design income was feast or famine. But I had something Evelyn didn't count on: Alara's meticulous nature, a surviving digital paper trail, and an unwavering, quiet rage that was now guiding my every move. My investigation started immediately. The first roadblock was the lack of official paperwork. When I asked Evelyn for a copy of the original appraisal documents, the ones Mr. Harrington had mentioned, she stonewalled me with bureaucratic scorn. "They're with the estate lawyer, and he's busy processing far more important things than your sentimental whims," she snapped over the phone. "You'll get copies when everything is finalized, which will take months. Stop calling me about this, it's becoming neurotic. Focus on earning a living." I knew I couldn't rely on the estate lawyer. He was representing the estate as a whole, which was essentially being managed by Evelyn and my father. I was on my own, relying on my skills as a digital investigator, a job I never thought I'd undertake. I changed tactics. If I couldn't get the legal proof of my ownership easily, I could prove her criminal action. I knew a few key details: rose gold, Victorian, forget-me, not engraving, antique locket, appraised at $15,000 in 2018. My search began with local, high-end antique jewelers, specialized estate buyers, and regional auction houses. I was looking for a recent sale, something that would have occurred in the 10 miserable days since Alara's death. Evelyn would have wanted the cash immediately, minimizing the chance of me seeing it. I spent 3 miserable, sleepless nights trawling through online auction catalogs and dealer websites in our state and the bordering ones. The search terms were specific, repetitive, and agonizingly slow. Victorian rose gold locket, forget-me-not antique pendant, estate liquidation jewelry, $15K. I had no idea of the seller's name or any identifying mark. It felt like a futile exercise, a desperate search for a needle in a haystack of digital inventory. My eyes blurred from the glare of the screen. I drank gallons of coffee, subsisting on adrenaline and spite. I almost gave up countless times, convinced that Evelyn had sold it to a private, untraceable buyer. Then, at 3:40 a.m. on the 4th morning, I tried a different search filter on a major regional auction house's website: recently sold items, estate jewelry. I scrolled through hundreds of listings, my fingers numb on the trackpad. Finally, buried deep in the archives, I saw it. The image was small, slightly blurry, and taken under harsh auction lighting, but it was unmistakable. The distinct oval shape, the telltale patina of rose gold, and the intricate pattern of the forget-me-nots that looked like tiny interwoven knots. LOT 412. Antique rose gold locket, early Victorian era. Hand-engraved floral motif. Private seller estate liquidation. The description was brief, clearly rushed by the auctioneer. The price? The hammer price was $12,500. Not $15,000, but close enough to the appraisal value to be credible, especially after a quick liquidation. The date of the auction was 5 days after Alara's funeral. The sense of cold precision in Evelyn's timing was chilling. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it would crack a rib. This was it, the first piece of the puzzle, a devastating moment of validation mixed with profound disgust. I immediately took multiple time-stamped screenshots of the listing, the photo, the description, the lot number, and the hammer price. I printed them out in high resolution, the ink a dark confirmation of my mother's betrayal. Now, I needed the formal documentation, the appraisal itself, to legally establish the locket's unique identity and value. I started a systematic search of Alara's house paperwork again. I knew Evelyn hated paperwork and deferred it until the last minute. I told my father I was coming over to pack up some of my childhood items that Alara had been storing in the attic, an excuse he accepted with his usual distant nod of compliance. The air in the house was now charged with my secret mission. I went straight to Alara's old desk in the spare bedroom, an area Evelyn had barely touched. Alara kept meticulous records, filing everything neatly in labeled folders. I focused on insurance and valuation documents. Under a thick, rubber-banded stack labeled Insurance Valuations Jewelry, I found it, the original appraisal document. It was a formal letterhead from Sterling and Company. Appraisals, dated June 20th, 2018. The description was identical to the auction listing, but with specific detail that made it irrefutable. Rose gold locket, 15K, 1.2 ounces weight, hand-engraved forget-me-nots on front panel, containing 2 original tintype portraits. Valuation for insurance purposes, $15,000. The document also contained a high-resolution, professional photograph of the locket. It was irrefutable. I scanned the document immediately using a high-resolution desktop scanner and emailed it to myself, saving multiple copies in encrypted folders. I put the original document back exactly where I found it, a final, necessary subterfuge. The second piece was found. I had the appraisal proving the locket's value and specific identification, and I had the auction listing proving its sale just days after Alara's death. Now, I needed the final, brutal link, Evelyn's admission. The thought of setting up my own mother filled me with a cold, hollow dread. It felt like a violation of the last scraps of familial decency. But she had forced this. She had crossed a line, and I had to cross one too. There was no turning back. The confession, small claims court in our state allowed claims up to $15,000, which was exactly the value of the locket. Crucially, in small claims, you represented yourself, no expensive lawyers required. The key was clear, compelling, and undeniable evidence. My screenshots and appraisal document proved the item existed, was valuable, and had been sold. I needed proof that Evelyn herself was the seller, and that she knew she was stealing it. A clear admission of conversion and intent. I needed her to admit it, on record. I devised a plan so simple and brutal, it made my stomach churn with self-disgust. I knew my mother's primary weakness, vanity, and an uncontrollable need to justify her actions, especially to herself, as shrewd business dealings and moral superiority. She would never admit fault. She would only boast of her pragmatism. I invited her to my apartment under the pretense of discussing the division of some antique books, a negotiation she would relish as it allowed her to condescend. I chose my apartment because I could control the setting, and because she was always deeply uncomfortable in my cramped, minimal space, making her defensive and highly prone to boastful self-aggrandizement. The setting was crucial. I placed my phone, recording audio and video, on a small, unsteady bookshelf across the room, angled to capture our conversation over the small coffee table. I covered the blinking recording light with a tiny piece of black tape, a detail I'd learned from a forgotten crime documentary. The phone looked innocuous, just resting among some paperbacks, charging. Evelyn arrived exactly 7 minutes late, immediately criticizing the neighborhood, the difficulty of the street parking, and the depressing view from my window. Honestly, Rhiannon, I don't know why you choose to live like this. It's so dreary. It reflects so poorly on us, she said, dusting off the chair before sitting. It's affordable, Mom, and it's mine, I replied, offering her a glass of filtered water in my best, calm voice. Look, I wanted to talk about the books, but also, I just wanted to clear the air about Grandma's things. I'm exhausted by the fighting. I led the conversation carefully, making myself sound defeated, worn down, and finally willing to compromise, playing the role of the pathetic, emotional daughter she thought I was. The locket. I'm still upset. It's not about the money, really. It's just that it was the last thing. I wish you had just let me have it, like she wanted. I understand the estate needed money, but I feel so cheated by the loss of the memory. Evelyn sighed dramatically, pulling a leather glove off her hand with a sharp, impatient snap. Oh, Rhiannon, for heaven's sake, why are you so dramatic? Get over it. It's gone. And I made a very wise financial decision, frankly. That $15,000 appraisal was a fantasy, a sentimental fantasy. I was lucky to get what I did, And it saved your father a headache from the taxman. I leaned in, trying to appear conspiratorial, lowering my voice. Wait, you sold it for less than $15,000? You should have told me. Maybe I could have bought it from you before the sale. She waved her hand dismissively, an arrogant gesture. That's just typical Rhiannon thinking, emotional and impractical. You never get full appraisal value, idiot. The auction house took a healthy commission, naturally, but it was still a substantial figure. Enough to cover the initial estate fees that Carol certainly won't pay. I had to pay them up front, to protect the assets. She paused, a glint of self-satisfaction and pride in her eye, basking in her own supposed brilliance. I sold it through Vance & Sons, that regional auction house. They're very discreet about estate liquidations. Vance & Sons, my suspicion confirmed. The name of the auction house matched the URL and the listing I had found. The puzzle was complete. But what about the will? Doesn't that matter? I asked, keeping my voice soft, almost pleading, pushing her to fully articulate her sense of superiority. She leaned back, crossing her legs, her face a portrait of smug, entitled superiority. The will is vague. A piece of paper written by a woman who hadn't filed her taxes properly in years. I have power of attorney over the estate right now. I made a judgment call. An excellent judgment call, financially. Look, Alara was practically senile when she made that ridiculous promise to you. She'd promised me the Sterling tea service years ago, before she changed her mind and gave it to that useless sister of mine, so she was clearly confused. She scoffed. You think a judge is going to take your word against mine, the executor of the estate? They'll see a sensible daughter-in-law making pragmatic choices to cover costs, and a spoiled granddaughter crying over a piece of old jewelry. You don't have a leg to stand on, Rhiannon. You're lucky I'm giving you an extra $750 for your troubles. She stood up, gathering her purse and adjusting her shawl. Now, I have a lunch date with a real estate agent to discuss selling the house. Are you going to keep those dusty old books, or should I tell the movers to grab them? I'll keep them, Mom, I said, rising slowly, my face blank. Good. Now, put this nonsense behind you. It's a closed book. Don't bring it up again. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, I stood frozen for a full minute, waiting to be sure she was gone. Then, I rushed to the bookshelf, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. The phone was still recording. I stopped the recording, carefully saved the file, and then immediately backed it up to 3 separate encrypted cloud storage accounts. I couldn't risk losing this single, perfect piece of evidence. The recording was devastatingly perfect. She admitted selling the locket. She named the auction house, Vance & Sons. She confirmed the value was near the appraisal, admitting the auction house took a cut. She admitted she was circumventing the specific bequest because she viewed the will as vague and her actions as pragmatic, effectively admitting intent to override Alara's wish for personal financial gain. She confirmed her superior attitude, believing I was too poor and powerless to fight her. I had the what appraisal, the where and when auction screenshots, and the who and why the recording. Evelyn thought the book was closed, but I had just found the key to the next, much darker and entirely public chapter. The fight was no longer a secret family drama. It was now a legal certainty. The emotional fallout from the recording was immense. It wasn't just proof of theft. It was a psychological X-ray of my mother's soul, an audible confirmation of her cold contempt for me. Hearing her smug certainty, her casual dismissal of my grief, and her cold calculation of profit felt like the final severing of an emotional tether I hadn't realized I was still holding on to. It wasn't just a locket. It was the last shred of hope that she possessed a maternal heart. I spent the next 3 weeks in a state of hyper-focused solitude, fueled by black coffee and a burning sense of righteous anger. My graphic design work became an unwelcome, but necessary, distraction. Every spare moment was dedicated to mastering the arcane rules of small claims court, or, as it was officially called, the Civil Claims Division. The state manual for self-represented litigants was a dense, bureaucratic document full of jargon that felt designed to confuse and deter the amateur. But I read it cover to cover, highlighting sections on conversion, the legal term for theft of personal property, breach of fiduciary duty, the potential charge if my mother was acting as an executor, and, most importantly, admissibility of evidence. My entire case rested on 3 pillars, all of which needed to be admissible and convincingly presented to a judge who would likely dedicate perhaps 15 minutes of their busy docket to my case. The document, Exhibit A, the original 2018 Sterling and Company appraisal, scanned and printed in high-resolution color. This established the locket's unique identity, description, and value. The transaction, Exhibit B, the Vance & Sons auction screenshots, printed with the URL, date, and hammer price. This established the fact of the sale and the immediate monetary loss. The admission, Exhibit C, the audio/video recording of Evelyn admitting the sale and the intent to override the will. This established liability and intent. The recording was the biggest hurdle. Could a secret recording be used in court? I researched wiretapping laws obsessively, terrified that I had compromised the entire case with an illegal act. Thankfully, our state was a one-party consent state, meaning only one person in the conversation, me, needed to know it was being recorded. The recording was legal, but its persuasive power in a courtroom was what truly mattered. I spent hours practicing how I would introduce it, how I would explain the chain of custody, and how I would ensure the judge could clearly hear my mother's chillingly casual admission. I transcribed the key minute of dialogue, word for word, and memorized it, knowing that the written word would reinforce the spoken truth. I calculated my claim meticulously. The locket was bequeathed to me. The will had been read, making the transfer of ownership legally effective at the time of Alara's death. Evelyn sold the property, conversion, which was legally mine. The sale price was $12,500, from which the auction house took a standard 10% commission, leaving Evelyn with $11,250. However, the will stated the locket was appraised at $15,000. My legal claim was for the full proven value of the item, which was $15,000 plus the small claims limit for court fees. I settled on claiming the full appraised amount, $15,000, arguing that the quick, unauthorized sale at a reduced auction price was itself a demonstration of negligence and bad faith, and that I was owed the full value of the specific item I was denied. The isolation was crushing. I couldn't tell my father. He would fold under Evelyn's pressure, or, worse, alert her to my intentions. I couldn't tell my few friends. The shame of having a mother who would steal a dead woman's gift from her own daughter felt too monumental to share. I was alone, locked in a digital war room, meticulously building a case against my own flesh and blood. Every keystroke felt like driving a wedge further into my fractured family structure, but it was a necessary surgery. I kept reminding myself that Alara's spirit, that constant beacon of light, was with me, guiding my hands over the cold steel of the law. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about defining reality. Filing the claim. The small claims filing office was situated in a dour, concrete building downtown, the interior dimly lit with the sickly yellow glow of institutional lights. The process was surprisingly mundane, yet felt deeply significant. Filling out 3 carbon copy forms, paying a small filing fee of $150 that depleted a large chunk of my emergency fund, and waiting in a short line between a man arguing with a dry cleaner and a woman disputing an old landlord debt. Ordinary disputes of money and goods. Mine felt like a dispute over the soul of a family. I filled out the form, my handwriting surprisingly steady as I checked the box for monetary damages. Plaintiff, Rhiannon Hayes. Defendant, Evelyn Hayes. Address, the address of my childhood home. Claim, conversion of personal property, antique locket. Basis of claim, explicit bequest via will, unlawful seizure and sale by defendant. Amount, $15,000. Writing defendant Evelyn Hayes felt like a physical act of severing, a line drawn in cement. It was no longer mom or mother or Evelyn, but defendant. A legal adversary. I signed the form with a hand that trembled slightly, a final acknowledgement of the point of no return. The clerk, a woman named Janice with tired eyes and a kind face, reviewed the forms. Claim is $15,000. Just under the limit. You'll be assigned a court date, and the sheriff's department will serve the defendant. You can't serve her yourself, dear. That's against the rules. I understand, I said, taking my copies. The anonymity of the sheriff delivering the summons was a small mercy. Good luck, dear. Family cases are always the hardest, Janice murmured, her expression compassionate, as if she knew the specific, cutting nastiness that often ended up in this division. The filing was the easy part. The waiting for the inevitable explosion was agony. The hurricane. 2 days later, the sheriff's deputy served Evelyn at the house. I was at my apartment, staring at my phone, unable to concentrate on work. When it finally rang, the screen flashed, "Mom." I knew what this was. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing for the hurricane, and answered on the third ring. "Rhiannon! What in God's name did you do?" Her voice was not merely angry. It was a shriek of violated dignity and profound surprise. It was the sound of a queen realizing she was being arrested by a common foot soldier. "Hello, Mom," I said calmly, deliberately letting my voice be low and level, a contrast to her hysteria. A deputy sheriff showed up at the house. In uniform, right in front of Mrs. Davies from next door, with a formal summons. You actually went through with it? Over that stupid, dusty piece of jewelry? You humiliated me in my own driveway? It was not a stupid piece of jewelry. It was a $15,000 heirloom that my grandmother explicitly left to me, and you stole it and sold it for cash within days of her death. That's called conversion, Mom. I'm just taking legal action to recover its proven value, as is my right. Conversion? Are you insane? I am your mother. I was managing the estate. This is harassment. It's slanderous. Do you have any idea the reputation damage you've caused? When your father hears about this, you will be cut off completely. Dad knows you sold it, Mom. The court process is public record. When the judge sees the evidence, the appraisal, the auction record, and your own recorded confession, Dad will know exactly how you prioritized money over your mother-in-law's last wishes and your own daughter's inheritance. Everyone will know. The mention of the recorded confession silenced her for a beat. That pause, that slight intake of breath, was the most satisfying, chillingly perfect sound I had heard in years. It meant she was calculating, not just raging. She was replaying our conversation in her mind, realizing the trap she had walked into. Confession? What are you talking about? I never confessed to anything. This is a complete fabrication. I told you I liquidated some minor estate assets to cover fees, which is completely legal. You're grasping at straws, Rhiannon. You will lose this case, and I swear, I will not only make you pay my extensive lawyer fees, I will make you pay my counterclaims for emotional distress and punitive damages. You're disowned. Do you hear me? Disowned. She slammed the phone down so hard, the impact echoed through my small apartment speaker. I hung up my own phone, my hand shaking not from fear, but from a surge of vindication so strong it felt like an electric current. I had breached her defenses. I had forced her to acknowledge that I was no longer the weak, easily dismissed daughter. I was an opponent, and I had just filed the opening volley in a civil war. The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by the exhilarating taste of self-empowerment. Evelyn's initial rage quickly crystallized into a predictable strategy of denial, character assassination, and legal deflection. She understood that, while small claims was for self-representation, she needed professional help to craft a believable counter-narrative and deal with the formality of the court. She couldn't afford a full-scale civil defense lawyer for a $15,000 dispute, but she hired a local paralegal/advisor to help her with the procedural aspects. Her official response to the court was a blanket denial, claiming the locket was a, quote, general unassigned household asset that she liquidated as part of her fiduciary duty to the estate to cover immediate expenses. She counterclaimed $5,000 for frivolous lawsuit and emotional distress and demanded I pay her costs. Her campaign outside the courthouse was more personal and insidious. She began calling family members and mutual friends, painting me as an ungrateful, money-hungry child, driven by bitterness and resentment, trying to bilk the estate out of a small fortune. Can you believe Rhiannon? After everything we've done for her, she's trying to sue me for an imaginary antique. She thinks that old locket was worth $15,000. The girl is desperate and unhinged, I heard through my father's sister, Aunt Carol. Aunt Carol, the recipient of the sterling tea set and a woman who had quietly endured Evelyn's condescension for decades, called me directly a week after the serving of the summons. Rhiannon, I don't know what's going on, but Evelyn is saying terrible, truly vicious things about you. That you've become obsessed with money and that you've driven a wedge between your father and her. She's demanding loyalty. Is this true? Carol's voice was cautious, tired of family conflict. I took a risk and laid out the facts, skipping the audio evidence for now, but confirming the will's explicit language, the existence of the appraisal, and the immediate auction sale. I knew that if I told Carol the full truth, she would either believe me and help, or dismiss me, and I would lose my only potential witness. She sold it 5 days after the funeral, Carol. She waited until the papers were finalized and then immediately put it up for sale. She stole my grandmother's last act of love, and now she's lying about it to everyone, including Dad. Carol was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching across the phone line. I could almost hear her mental calculation of the decades of subtle malice she had endured from Evelyn. Your grandmother was very specific about that locket. She told me about it too. She was so insistent that it skip Evelyn. She said she was doing it because you understood what inheritance really meant. The history, not the dollar amount. She told me the locket represented the part of the family history that Evelyn had chosen to ignore. Did she ever talk to you about the appraisal value or the original paperwork? I asked, my voice barely a breath, hoping for a secondary confirmation. Yes, Alara was always worried about the insurance, especially as the locket was so small and portable. She told me the valuation was $15,000, and she had the papers tucked away somewhere safe. She said she was trying to avoid the estate taxes on it by giving it away before death, but then realized she couldn't, so she made the will's wording as careful as possible to guarantee it bypassed Evelyn and the general estate. A witness. Aunt Carol had independent, non-biased testimony to the grandmother's intent and her knowledge of the specific valuation. Her testimony would confirm that Alara, far from being senile or confused, was meticulously planning around Evelyn's predicted actions. Carol, would you be willing to testify on my behalf? It's just small claims. We don't even need a lawyer. We just need to go there, tell the truth about Grandma's wishes, and stand up for what she wanted. The pause this time was weighted with family history. Carol and Evelyn had a long, bitter rivalry. This was more than testifying. It was taking a side in the final family conflict, publicly and definitively. It meant permanently losing any possibility of reconciliation with Evelyn. Yes, Carol finally said, her voice firm and decisive. I will. Alara loved you, Rhiannon. She made sure you had that one piece of truth in your life. That woman, Evelyn, has always been a viper. It's time someone stood up to her without worrying about the consequences she threatens. Tell me when and where. The witness was secured. My case, which had been resting only on documents and a covert recording, now had a human face, a corroborating voice of truth. It was a crucial shield against Evelyn's expected onslaught of character attacks. I was no longer fighting alone. Preparation and the final wedge. The trial date was set for 6 weeks after the initial filing. It was a terrifying countdown. I had become an amateur litigator, my apartment littered with sticky notes, legal pads, and copies of the small claims manual. My most crucial preparation was assembling the physical exhibits. Judges in small claims court rely on things that are immediately clear and easy to absorb, as they do not have time for nuance. They needed visual impact. I prepared 3 exhibit boards using high-quality poster board and graphic design skills honed by years of freelance work. Exhibit A, the proof of ownership and value. Blown-up copy of the key clause from the will, emphasizing the words, "To my granddaughter Rhiannon Hayes, as a direct transmission of lineage and love, I bequeath the antique rose gold Victorian locket, appraised at $15,000 in 2018. High-resolution scan of the Sterling & Company. Appraisal, clearly showing the $15,000 value, the detailed description, and the locket's unique photo. Exhibit B, the proof of sale. Screenshots of the Vance & Sons auction listing, annotated to show the lot number, the specific description matching the appraisal, the date of sale, 5 days post-funeral, and the hammer price of $12,500. Exhibit C, the admission of conversion and intent. Full transcribed script of the key conversation with Evelyn, with the most damaging lines highlighted in red marker. I sold it through Vance & Sons. I made a judgment call. Alara was practically senile when she made that ridiculous promise to you. Crucially, I also had my phone, now connected to a high-quality external speaker I borrowed from a friend, ready to play the audio. I rehearsed my presentation dozens of times in front of the mirror, timing myself to keep it under the expected 10 minutes. I needed to be concise, factual, and emotionally controlled. I practiced referring to my mother only as the defendant, Ms. Hayes, or Evelyn, refusing to let the intimacy of Mom soften the facts of the case. I needed to be a plaintiff, not a daughter. My father was the hardest, saddest part of the preparation. He had been stonily quiet since the summons. He didn't yell, he didn't intervene, he simply went emotionally dark, retreating into his study and his books. He refused to discuss the lawsuit with me, only sending short, cold text messages demanding I drop this immediately and apologize to your mother for the sake of the family. I knew he was torn, but he was also a man who fundamentally avoided conflict at all costs. He had chosen Evelyn's manipulative peace over the difficult truth decades ago, and he was choosing her now by his silence. His primary concern was the disruption to his comfortable, quiet life, not the moral rightness of the cause. A week before the trial, I finally sent him a short, painful email, CCing Aunt Carol for transparency. Dad, I am going to court on date to recover the value of the locket Grandma left me. This isn't about hurting Mom. It's about honoring Grandma and defending myself against her lies. The evidence is irrefutable. I have the auction records and an audio recording of Mom admitting the sale and the intent to override the will. I did this because I know she is lying to you too, about the circumstances. The choice to lie and steal was hers. The choice to seek justice is mine. I wish you wouldn't attend, as it will be hard enough, but I want you to know the truth before it's read into public record. I am not backing down. He never replied. His silence was the final, sad confirmation of my necessity to proceed alone. This wasn't just about the locket. It was about ending the generational cycle of manipulation and silence that Evelyn had imposed on our family. I was fighting for Alara's honor, but ultimately, for my own moral clarity. The night before the court date, I was too wired to sleep. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed, and humming with adrenaline. The next day would be the culmination of 6 weeks of intense focus and a lifetime of subtle emotional warfare. I felt like a soldier preparing for a battle I could not afford to lose, the fate of my self-respect hanging in the balance. I paced my small apartment, reviewing my notes and running the recorded conversation again and again until Evelyn's voice was just a monotone drone in my ears. I needed to neutralize the emotion of it before I walked into the courtroom. I reread Alara's letters, looking for strength, a tangible connection to her kindness. I pulled a book she had given me, a worn, leather-bound edition of classic English poetry. Tucked inside, in the pages of Wordsworth, I found the small, unmarked envelope containing the tiny, folded piece of paper that was always hidden in the locket's second compartment. I unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle and thin. It wasn't a poem, or a biblical quote, or a romantic sentiment. It was just 4 words, written in Alara's elegant, slightly shaky cursive, a testament to her simple, unyielding moral compass. Remember who you are. Tears finally came, hot and stinging, not of despair, but of recognition and profound love. Alara knew. She knew my mother would steal, she knew I would be forced to fight, and she knew the stakes were higher than money. The note was her final, private counsel. Do not let her define you. Do not let her win, because you are afraid to fight her. You are a Hayes, but you are an Alara, not an Evelyn. I put the note back in the envelope. The locket was gone, but the lesson, the inheritance of courage, was right here, etched into my memory. I finalized my outfit. A simple, dark blue dress, professional, understated, and respectable. I made sure my phone was fully charged and the external speaker tested. I carefully packed my exhibit boards into a large portfolio. Then, I practiced my opening statement one last time, standing tall in my small living room, addressing the empty couch as if it were the judge. Your Honor, my claim is for the conversion of personal property explicitly bequeathed to me by my grandmother. The defendant, Evelyn Hayes, unlawfully seized and sold this property immediately after my grandmother's funeral. I will prove 3 things. 1, that the locket belonged to me. 2, that the defendant sold it. And 3, that she did so intentionally and in bad faith, overriding the deceased's specific final wishes. I was ready. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now cold, sharp, and useful, like a surgeon's scalpel, a tool I could wield with precision. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, situated on the 10th floor of the municipal building. It was a simple, functional room, smelling faintly of old wood and industrial cleaning solution. Small claims cases were handled in a simple, office-like setting, designed for speed, not drama. Judge Wallace, a silver-haired woman in her late 50s with a calm, neutral, and slightly world-weary expression, sat behind a slightly elevated desk. She looked like a woman who had seen every kind of human pettiness imaginable. I arrived early with Aunt Carol, who looked nervous but determined in a conservative gray suit. We sat on one side of the room, my portfolio of exhibits neatly stacked on the table before me. Carol leaned over and squeezed my arm. We're doing the right thing, Rhiannon. For Alara, Evelyn arrived exactly 10 minutes before the scheduled time, maximizing her opportunity for a dramatic entrance. She wore a severe, expensive charcoal gray power suit with sharp shoulders, a costume of authority, and carried a thin briefcase, her face set in a theatrical expression of wronged indignation. She was flanked not by a lawyer, but by her paralegal advisor, a nervous young man who kept adjusting his tie and shuffling his papers. She saw me, and her eyes, cold and hard, lingered on me for a moment, a stare filled with pure, unadulterated contempt. Then, her gaze fell upon Aunt Carol. Evelyn's expression hardened instantly into a venomous, betrayed stare. The shock that her sister-in-law had sided with me, the enemy, clearly stung her pride more than the lawsuit itself. "Traitor," she mouthed silently to Carol, her lips barely moving. Carol met her gaze unflinchingly, a small, subtle victory for my side before the proceedings even began. Our case, Hayes versus Hayes, was called at 11:15 a.m. Judge Wallace read the charge and asked if the defendant, Evelyn Hayes, wished to make an opening statement. Evelyn stood, smoothing her skirt with an air of theatrical calm, clearly relishing the chance to speak. Your Honor, this is a frivolous and emotionally driven lawsuit. The plaintiff is my daughter, Rhiannon, and she is an ungrateful child who is attempting to manipulate the estate proceedings. I was managing the complex affairs of my mother-in-law's estate. The will was confusing, listing a highly inflated, unverified value for a piece of costume jewelry. I, acting prudently, liquidated some unassigned assets to cover immediate essential estate fees. I have attempted to offer the plaintiff a generous settlement, but she has refused. This case is about a family spat, a child's resentment, not a legal wrong, and I request it be dismissed. Her performance was flawless, polished, professional, and entirely dishonest. She made it sound like I was suing her for a lost sock, not a $15,000 theft. Then it was my turn. I stood up, walked to the table, and gripped the edge firmly. My voice, surprisingly, was steady, a clear, sharp tone that commanded attention. Your Honor, this is not a family spat. This is a claim for the theft or conversion of property specifically bequeathed to me. I will prove, not allege, that the locket was legally mine the moment my grandmother passed, that the defendant sold it intentionally and immediately, and that she did so in bad faith, overriding the deceased's specific final wishes and defrauding me of my inheritance. Judge Wallace nodded, leaning forward, already flipping through the file containing the initial pleadings. Understood. Proceed, Ms. Hayes. Present your case. I began by introducing Exhibit A. I placed the blown-up will clause and the appraisal on the easel. The color prints of the legal documents were stark and undeniable. Your Honor, this clause in the final will of Alara Hayes explicitly assigns the locket to me, Rhiannon Hayes. It is named specifically the antique rose gold Victorian locket. The second page is the professional appraisal from Sterling and Company, clearly showing the item's photo, its unique description, and its established value for insurance purposes, $15,000. The locket was, therefore, my legal property upon my grandmother's death by clear testamentary intent. Evelyn's paralegal advisor stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The will reading and execution were complex. The item was mixed with general assets, and the appraisal is 6 years old and unverified. It's irrelevant hearsay. The document is admissible as a record of valuation referenced in the will, Judge Wallace ruled, dismissing the objection. The age of the appraisal goes to the weight of the evidence, not its admissibility. Continue, Ms. Hayes. I moved to Exhibit B, detailing the auction sale, the dark print of the screenshots a contrast to the elegant appraisal document. Your Honor, just 5 days after my grandmother's funeral, before any formal division of assets and despite the clear language of the will, the locket was sold. Here are the screenshots from Vance & Sons, a regional auction house showing lot 412, an item matching the exact description, sold for $12,500. This proves the conversion occurred and confirms the approximate value of the sale. I then called my first and only witness, Aunt Carol. Carol was sworn in. I kept the questions simple, focusing only on the grandmother's state of mind, intent, and knowledge of the specific valuation. Carol, did my mother, Alara Hayes, ever discuss the locket with you in relation to her granddaughter, Rhiannon? Yes, several times. She was very worried about it. She said it was Rhiannon's and that it was the only thing she truly wanted her to have, specifically asking me to try and ensure Rhiannon received it before Evelyn could seize it. Did she ever mention the monetary value of that locket? Yes. She said the insurance appraisal was $15,000. She was very clear on that figure, and she often expressed concern that Evelyn would sell it if she got her hands on it. She said she was trying to legally outmaneuver her own daughter-in-law. Evelyn, on the other side of the room, was shaking her head violently, muttering under her breath about conspiracy and hearsay. I finished with Carol quickly, and then moved to the climax, Exhibit C. Your Honor, the defendant claims she liquidated unassigned assets out of necessity. I submit that the locket was clearly assigned. Furthermore, I have evidence that the defendant acted with full knowledge of the locket's value and sale, and intentionally sought to circumvent the will for her own financial benefit, all while believing I was too poor and powerless to fight her. I placed the transcription of the key conversation on the stand and picked up my phone and speaker. The courtroom was silent. Everyone in the room sensed the final hammer blow was coming. I ask for permission to play a 1-minute segment of a recorded conversation between myself and the defendant from 5 weeks ago, where she admits to the conversion and articulates her intention. Evelyn shot up from her chair, her face a mask of scarlet fury. Objection, Your Honor. This is entrapment. This is illegal surveillance. I never consented to being recorded. This is a violation of my privacy. Judge Wallace held up a hand. Ms. Hayes, please sit down. Counsel, is this a one-party consent state? It is, Your Honor, I confirmed. And the recording is presented to demonstrate intent and admission against interest. Then the audio is admissible. Continue, Ms. Hayes. You may proceed. With a trembling finger, I pressed play. The small courtroom was instantly filled with the amplified, cold, dismissive voice of Evelyn Hayes. The sound quality was surprisingly good, broadcasting her arrogance perfectly. Evelyn's voice, loud and clear. That $15,000 appraisal was a fantasy. I was lucky to get what I did, and it saved your father a headache. I sold it through Vance & Sons, that regional auction house. They're very discreet about estate liquidations. My voice. But what about the will? Doesn't that matter? Evelyn's voice. The will is vague. A piece of paper written by a woman who hadn't filed her taxes properly in years. I made a judgment call. An excellent judgment call, financially. You think a judge is going to take your word against mine, the executor of the estate? They'll see a sensible daughter-in-law and a spoiled granddaughter crying over a piece of old jewelry. You don't have a leg to stand on, Rhiannon. The silence after the recording ended was absolute. Evelyn was slumped in her chair, her perfectly composed mask shattered, her head bowed in the sudden, inescapable reality of her own documented malice. I spoke one last time, my voice ringing with a conviction born of months of quiet preparation. Your Honor, this recording proves that the defendant's conversion of my property was intentional, informed, and motivated by a malicious belief that she could act with impunity. I am asking the court to hold her legally liable for the full appraised value of the property she unlawfully converted, $15,000. The defense collapses. Evelyn's defense, when it came, was pitiful. Her paralegal, now looking increasingly like he regretted taking the job, tried to argue that the recording was taken out of context, that Evelyn was merely boasting or exaggerating, and that she was talking about other unassigned assets sold through Vance & Sons. He stammered, poorly organized, visibly intimidated by the judge's focused scrutiny. Judge Wallace cut him off sharply. Counsel, the recording is quite clear. The defendant mentions the $15,000 appraisal specifically in relation to the sale through Vance & Sons. Furthermore, the will is not vague. It names the item explicitly by description and specific value. Ms. Hayes, you may speak on your own behalf. Why did you sell an item explicitly bequeathed to your daughter just 5 days after your mother-in-law's death? Evelyn stood up again, her composure completely gone, her eyes darting between me and the judge, desperately seeking a loophole. Her expensive suit seemed to suddenly weigh her down, a costume of failure. Your Honor, she stammered, her voice high and strained. I was protecting the estate. I needed the money. The funeral costs were astronomical, and the estate fees needed immediate capital. My husband's sister, Carol, wasn't contributing, and I was trying to manage everything alone. I was under immense pressure. That girl, she gestured wildly at me, venom returning to her voice. She doesn't understand the burden of responsibility. She never appreciated the locket anyway. She just wanted to cause trouble and hurt me. I needed to be pragmatic. Pragmatism requires following the law, Ms. Hayes, Judge Wallace observed coolly, consulting her notes. You state you needed to liquidate assets to cover fees, yet the will shows substantial liquid monetary assets remaining to be divided between your husband and his sister. Your claim that the locket, the only specific personal item bequeathed to your daughter, was a necessary liquidation seems highly questionable, especially given the rapid nature of the sale. Evelyn tried one last defense, her voice descending into a desperate whine. It was a mistake. An oversight. I should have known she would use this to tear the family apart, but I never intended to steal anything. I will buy her a new, better locket. I will offer her $5,000 now. The time for settlement was before this court date, Ms. Hayes. The case is now based on conversion, Judge Wallace stated firmly. She stared Evelyn down, and Evelyn had no answer left. She simply stared, defeated, at the floor. She had relied on bluster, social standing, and denial. Once her own words and the cold facts were used against her, she had nothing left but the naked, ugly truth of her greed. She had lost the narrative completely. Judge Wallace recessed for 30 minutes to review the evidence one final time. The wait was excruciating. Evelyn sat across the room, refusing to look at me or Carol. She looked like a statue of defeat, pale and rigid, occasionally running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. When the judge returned, the clerk called the court to order. Judge Wallace opened her folder, the sound of the paper rustling echoing in the small, charged room. In the matter of Rhiannon Hayes versus Evelyn Hayes, the court has reviewed the testamentary document, the independent appraisal, the auction record, the submitted audio evidence, and the witness testimony. She looked directly at Evelyn, her gaze uncompromising. Ms. Evelyn Hayes, the court finds your argument of confusion and necessary liquidation to be entirely unpersuasive. The bequest was clear, the appraisal value was known to you, and the swift sale of this specific item immediately following the death constitutes a clear act of conversion of personal property belonging to the plaintiff. Your intent, as confirmed by your own recorded statements and the testimony of your sister-in-law, was to willfully override the explicit terms of the will for personal gain, believing the plaintiff lacked the means to challenge you. She paused, allowing the weight of the finding to settle. Therefore, judgment is entered in favor of the plaintiff, Rhiannon Hayes. A wave of heat washed over me, a physical shock that was part relief, part vindication. I gripped Carol's hand so tightly, I thought I might break her fingers. The court awards the plaintiff the full appraised value of the converted property, $15,000. $15,000. Furthermore, the court dismisses the defendant's frivolous counterclaim for emotional distress and punitive damages. The defendant is ordered to pay the full judgment amount plus court costs to the plaintiff within 30 days. $15,000. The exact value, not the reduced auction price, but the full symbolic weight of Alara's legacy. Justice had been rendered in the exact measure of the original theft. I heard a small, strangled gasp from Evelyn's side of the room. She looked up, her eyes glazed with shock. She had genuinely believed she would win, that her status as mother and executor would insulate her from consequence. She had lost to a self-represented starving artist, armed only with a moral compass and a smartphone. The hearing was over. As Judge Wallace left the bench, Evelyn stood up, stumbling slightly, her expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and threadbare under the cold, fluorescent lights. She stared at me, her face contorted, not with rage, but with a hatred so pure, so cold, it was terrifying. "You," she hissed, her voice husky with suppressed fury. "You destroyed this family for money. You put your own mother through this public degradation over an item that didn't matter?" "No, Mom," I said, meeting her eyes, my voice steady. "You destroyed this family the moment you put the cash value of that locket above your own mother's memory and your daughter's heart. I simply brought your actions into the light. I didn't destroy the family. I just exposed the lie it was built on, and I got Grandma's last wish validated by the law." I walked out with Aunt Carol, who squeezed my hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Alara would be so proud of you, honey," she murmured. We left Evelyn standing alone by the table, gathering her scattered papers, abandoned by her paralegal, her father's absence the final, silent judgment, the final severing. The payment arrived exactly 29 days later, a cashier's check for $15,150, covering the judgment and court costs, mailed by Evelyn's paralegal, not by her. It was a cold, transactional exchange that closed the legal chapter but began the final, permanent emotional one. Evelyn, once she realized she couldn't appeal the small claims ruling, shifted into full victim mode, attempting a final, desperate smear campaign. She circulated a story that I had blackmailed her, that the audio was digitally doctored, and that the judge was biased. She tried to convince my father I had set her up, that I had lured her to my apartment with malicious intent. I knew I needed to publicly seal the truth to counter her final gaslighting and protect my own name and sanity. I wrote a long, detailed letter, a careful explanation of the facts, the specific language of the will, the existence of the appraisal, the exact name of the auction house, and the clear, unambiguous court judgment awarding me $15,000 for conversion. I referenced the judge's finding regarding her recorded statements and the dismissal of her counterclaim. I copied this letter and sent it to every mutual family member, every cousin, and all of my father's professional acquaintances who had attended the funeral. I sent it not to wound, but to educate. The truth was my final, ultimate weapon. The reaction was immediate and decisive. My father was furious, not at Evelyn, but at me for making the situation public and destroying his fragile peace. He called, his voice dull with exhaustion and bitterness. "Rhiannon, you have to stop this. You've ruined your mother's reputation. Our standing in the community is irreparable. Why couldn't you just take the money and be quiet? Why do you have to be so difficult? Because, Dad, if I was quiet, she would continue to lie, and everyone would think I was the money-hungry, ungrateful child. I proved she was a thief and a liar in a court of law. I will not be quiet so her lies can breathe and your life can remain comfortable. I chose the truth, and I chose Grandma. You've forced her hand. You've forced mine," he choked out. "We won't speak to you again until you apologize to your mother and retract that terrible letter." "I mean it, Rhiannon. You're disowned." It was the final, devastating choice. He chose the path of least resistance, which was Evelyn. He chose his own comfort over his daughter's moral defense. "Then I guess we won't speak again, Dad," I replied, my voice shaking only slightly. The pain was immense, a dull ache where a relationship used to be, but it was a clean break. I hung up the phone and cried, for the first and last time since the verdict. I had lost both parents, but I had saved myself. The final act of severing came later that month. I scheduled an appointment at the county courthouse and filled out a petition for name change. My full name was Rhiannon Evelyn Hayes. I had been named after my mother, a link I now found toxic and intolerable. The irony of carrying her name, the name of the woman who had stolen my grandmother's last gift, had become a perpetual scar. I needed to wash it off me. On the form, under Desired New Name, I wrote, Rhiannon Alara Hayes. I wasn't changing my surname, that link to my father's family, but I was removing the middle name that stood for betrayal, avarice, and manipulation, and replacing it with the name that stood for light, love, moral strength, and the courage to seek justice. It was a small, symbolic move, requiring only a few signatures and a small fee, but in the context of our war, it felt like taking a fortress. It was a public declaration. I was her daughter no more. I was Alara's lineage, inheritance of light. Sitting in my apartment, now legally Rhiannon Alara Hayes, I looked at the bank statement showing the 5-figure deposit, the $15,000 legacy of betrayal. The money was cold, but the resolution was warm, glowing with the clarity of a necessary choice. The process had been grueling, isolating, and emotionally devastating. But I realized I didn't just win a lawsuit, I won my independence and my self-definition. Evelyn's final, cruel act was designed to ensure I was forever diminished, dependent on her, and perpetually overshadowed by her dominance. By fighting back, by mastering the law, and presenting the undeniable truth, I had established a boundary more solid than any lawyer could have drawn. I was a person who fought for her truth, even when the opponent was her own mother. The heirloom I hadn't inherited was the physical object, the rose gold locket. It was lost to the anonymous wealth of a collector, a sad but settled reality. But the heirloom I did inherit was the strength, the moral clarity, and the quiet, unyielding wisdom of Alara herself. Her last words to me, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, had guided me from a helpless daughter to a victorious plaintiff. I began to feel lighter. The grief for my grandmother remained, a steady, warm presence, but the bitterness about the locket was replaced by the deep satisfaction of justice and self-empowerment. I used the money not to splurge, but to finally invest in myself. I bought the high-end computer equipment I needed to take on larger, higher-paying graphic design contracts. The money was now not a mark of Evelyn's greed, but the foundation of my future, the capital for a life lived entirely on my own terms. The locket was gone, but the name, Rhiannon Ilara Hayes, was a new golden shield. The truth, in the end, was the sharpest, most valuable inheritance of all. I had not only taken back the money, I had taken back her name, and in doing so, I had taken back my own.